Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. We are holding this evening the second archive talk in the exhibition of Katharina Sieverding here at K21. And the talk is entitled Glam and Underground, Katharina Sieverding and Klaus Mettig in New York, 1976-1977. This is also the title of the archive presentation that we are showing here behind me. We focus on their attendance in this time to the Whitney Independent Study Program, to the New School of Social Research, and the consolidation of their network in the States. On Tuesday, we'll feature the third archive presentation entitled What Does It Actually Mean to be German? Was bedeutet eigentlich Deutsch sein? Where we show material related to the reception of Katharina's iconic work, Deutschland wir Deutsche, and about also other series of works and also her international teaching. In the first place, I want to apologize for A.A. Bronson, who cannot come due to health issues. On his behalf, I want to express his love for Katharina, Klaus, and also his apologies for not being here this evening. But notwithstanding, we are honored to have Marc Siegel and Erika Balsom, leading voices in the studies of queer, feminist, and experimental filmmaking. A brief introduction. Marc Siegel is professor of film studies at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, where his research explores the intersection of queer studies and experimental film. His book, A Gossip of Images, is on the pipeline to be published by the Duke University Press. He has co-edited several publications, including Sèche d'Année and Queer Cinephilia, Film Culture AV, The Legend of Barbara Rubin, and a special issue of the journal Criticism dedicated to the underground artist Jack Smith, which is also a topic here in the archive presentation. Beyond his academic work, Marc is an accomplished curator, having organized numerous film series and programs for festivals, museums, and galleries worldwide, such as the Berlin Biennial, the Berlinale in the Tate Modern in London, and the CCVB in Barcelona. Marc Siegel is also a member of the Akademie der Künste der Welt in Cologne. He serves on the advisory board of the Forum Expanded section of the Berlinale, and he's a co-founder of the Berlin-based collective Sheep, or C-H-E-A-P. I don't know how you pronounce the collective's name, Sheep, so I did it right. And Erika Balsom is reader in film studies at King's College in London. She's also the author of 4 books, including After Uniqueness, A History of Film and Video Art in Circulation, and 10 Skies. Her writing has appeared in publications including Kajedach, Flux, and New Left Review. With Hila Pelek, she has co-curated the show No Master Territories, Feminist World Making in the Moving Image, and she is the co-editor of the books Feminist World Making and the Moving Image and Documentary Across Disciplines, both published by the MIT Press. So we're going to have time for the talk, and afterwards there are also a time for questions if you like. And please welcome Marc Siegel and Erika Balsom. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Victor, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Marc and I will be having a conversation. I think that we'll orbit a little around the words of the title of the talk. Glam, Underground, Katharina Sieverding, Klaus Mettig, and New York. I think these will sort of be our main touchstones. So maybe we can start with glamour. I was preparing for the talk tonight, and I started to think about where this word came from. And I looked it up, and it has an earlier meaning of enchantment or spell. And before that, it comes from the word grammar. And the idea was that grammar was something that applied not only to language, but also to any kind of learning, including learning about the occult. So maybe to get us started, what is the grammar of glamour? In the work of Katharina Sieverding.
Oh, that's nice. challenging start, Erika. Maybe I'll just think about this. If we think of glamour, and I think we also, of course, will want to make a distinction between glamour and glam.
Absolutely.
Right? Like if glam is like associated with, let's say, I don't know, glam rock, or like a specific materialization of glamorous self-staging. But the grammar of glamour in her work, what I first start thinking about is to think of the, if we think of glamour as a mystification, if we think of glamour as something that is actually not something that necessarily comes from within.
Maybe it especially doesn't come from within.
Let's say that glamour does not come from within, that glamour is something that is produced in relation to something outside of the self, or that something outside of the self actually helps create that mystification that is the glamorous image. I mean, if we look at, if we just look at these amazing faces around us, if we think of the slick surfaces, we think of the kind of misty-eyed quality through the enlargement. Those are aspects that, to me, the slick surfaces both reflect us when we look at them. So we are, in that sense, invoked by this glamorous production. We are part of the grammar, if you will, but they also create a distance, right? So that this is kind of untouchable beauty, untouchable both in the I don't know if it's a temporal distance, if it's just a spatial distance, but so it seems like glamour then, or the grammar of glamour has something to do with like the organizing structure in the work. We can talk about the material way that that's created. I mentioned some of it with the slickness of the image, the enlargement, but the organizing structure, but I think also the kind of system of relations that it establishes between a viewer, between something outside the glamorous person and that person, that it's that relationship that actually is fundamental to the construction of what we think of as glamorous. Is that too abstract?
Yeah, well, I'll maybe try and drag it down into concreteness a little.
Drag me down into concreteness.
Into concreteness. I mean, A.A. Bronson is not here tonight, but File magazine, the artist publication that he made as a part of General Idea, they put out a glamour issue. Mm-hmm. And in the glamour issue of that magazine, they wrote a text in which they talk about wanting to be glamorous, wanting to be famous artists, and they say, if we are going to be glamorous, we are going to need to be plagiarists. And there's an idea there that to be glamorous is always to copy. And I think we see in Sieverding's work this interest in serial replication happening in lots of ways across the different works. But I wonder, how we think about this idea of glamour as copying something else, which is maybe a form of relationality that you're talking about, and the production of this untouchable, exceptional diva image. If we think of, the glamorousness, for instance, of the star in Close Up, there's a sense of something exceptional, unique, but something that is also made for mass circulation, mass reproduction. And so maybe somehow it's in that tension coming out of, for instance, the close-up of the star in cinema.
Yeah. I think there's interesting, like, two elements that stand out for me, like that how glamour, like if you think of old Hollywood glamour portraits, where I think some of these images, I was looking at this, that's one of the things I find so incredible is the repetition of Katharina Sieverding's face, but also the fact that each time I come into the room, I'm like, is that Katharina Sieverding? Is that her? Is that really her? And I was like, no, that's Ava Gardner. Like that's like a 40s Hollywood actress. So there's the repetition of the same, but of course the different stylization. But when I mention like old 40s Hollywood glamour portraits, part of what I think makes them, part of what is fundamental to glamour, and that's part of this mystification aspect, is that you don't know how, you don't see the work that goes into producing the glamorous image. It's not like, that would, let's say, demystify the glamour, that it's something, so that the glamorous image, maybe this is a difference between glamour and glam. If you think of glam rock, where you put on some make, where it's somewhat brought down to earth, but the glamour, I think in these photos, but also in Hollywood glamour portraits, is that you can't understand how this was made. It's somehow elevated, maybe to the occult, like you brought up, but elevated to a different realm.
Which is maybe related to this idea of glamour as a kind of enchantment or as a kind of spell.
Yeah. The star.
The star. And it strikes me as, really important to think about this kind of invocation of stardom and glamour as happening in the 1970s, the era of glam, sure, but we can also say a time of second wave feminism, when there was a demand for the production of images of women that would not be glamorous. So these works were also, some of them were produced at a time when one kind of line of feminist art was, strip away the artifice, show natural beauty. You have lots of artists who are interested in pursuing some idea of an essentialist femininity. And that is resolutely not what we find here at all. Instead, there's really a claiming of the potentiality of artifice, travesty, performativity, and surface. Right? And to think of maybe the natural body as a myth or a trap that one could potentially escape through this recruitment of plasticity, makeup, becoming, glamorousness.
Right. And would you say you see like a feminist decision to take control of objectification, a kind of self-objectification, a resistance of some kind of simplistic division between, the subject and, like if we think of in Laura Mulvey in film study is a kind of classic, also important for visual culture. Laura Mulvey, British feminist filmmaker and theorist, who in 1975 wrote an important essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, a critique of Hollywood cinema, of particular kind of Hollywood cinema in the 40s and 50s. And one of the kind of takeaway clever phrases is that men look and women have the quality of to be looked at. And that could lead into simplistic ideas that women are always objects and can't, and some people felt one can't, or men can't represent women, can't even have women in their films, because you can't escape this kind of male gaze, these kind of ideas.
The male gaze is one of the most abused concepts in visual studies, I would say. But I think it's interesting. I think what people most remember from Mulvey's essay is this idea that there should be a refusal, of that kind of visual pleasure, a sense of what she calls passionate detachment. And if you think about the film that she made with Peter Wallen, Riddles of the Sphinx, she uses all of these 360-degree pans so that the body of the woman is never sort of captured in the frame. Okay, that's one way. But I would say Sieverding gives us another way that we could say is almost like critical mimicry or a kind of hyperbolization of the spectacle of woman. And I think there are also hints of that in Mulvey's essay when she talks about Joseph von Sternberg, someone who shot Marlene Dietrich in a way that foregrounded the surface of the image, the artifice, to the point that it shows itself, right? Because again, I think it's about denaturalizing certain conventions. And here, when we have this immense magnification of the face, the scale of the printing is super important. And also this interest on replication, iteration, seriality. You know, this is also pointing, I think, to the machinic nature of these images, right? You know? And all of that, I think, puts pressure on a kind of easy consumption of the female body, you know? So I do see that, you know, one strategy would be refusal, but another would be sort of push it to the point where it begins to crack. And that's a little bit more what I see here, and I think that, you know, we can think maybe also in terms of our other term for tonight, underground, this idea of, you know, appropriating mass cultural conventions and pushing them to the point where they become so extreme that they point to their own constructedness and so on. This is a classic kind of strategy out of avant-garde filmmaking, whether it's, you know, in the work of someone like Kenneth Anger or Jack Smith. Right.
And maybe we could come to Jack Smith. I like your description, let's say, of what Katharina Sieverding is doing with these images of pushing that something to the point where it cracks, that kind of system. And because it helps me also understand why we have these cracks in the image, if you will, why we have three panels that we don't. I think that's really important that we don't in most of the images. I mean, in the Stauffenberg block we have a different thing going on, but in these big glamour portraits, this idea of, I mean, how, you know, this kind of self-conscious splitting of the image, of not allowing it to be whole in that way, or not allowing it to be whole without recognizing the material construction of it in the exhibition, in its exhibiting, seems very exemplary of what I think you're describing. So I think,
I mean, also we were discussing the hang of the show and the sense that all of the images are positioned a little higher than perhaps a traditional hang would have them. And again, you know, that's something that asks you to recalibrate your body in relation to these images. They sort of exceed you somehow. You have to look up at them. You really become aware of their scale, their construction. You know, they are maybe familiar from the format of an advertisement or a billboard or something like that, but then not quite. Something is twisted.
Right. And maybe if we're on this scale of like cracks in the production of glamour, cracks in the self-representation as glamorous, we can maybe talk about Jack Smith in that sense, because Jack Smith, for people who don't know who he is, I mean, Jack Smith sounds like Jakob Schmidt. I mean, it just sounds like everybody's neighbor or something, just a very ordinary, basic person. But he was a quite an oddball. He was kind of most known, maybe today, still as the filmmaker who made the most scandalous, notorious American underground film of the 1960s, if not of all time, a film called Flaming Creatures, which he made in 1962 and 1963. And it was a scandal at the time because of its depiction of, let's say, gender play, of transgender figures, of transsexual figures, in kind of beautiful, cloudy, black and white, 16mm footage, where it was very difficult to necessarily discern in some scenes, not only if this was a man or a woman, but if the body parts that he shows, if like genitals, how the genitals connect with other body parts, and how that will come together to perhaps construct a gender or sexual identity. So that there's lots of cracks, if you will, in the representation of the body in these images of body parts in Jack Smith's film, and it creates kind of open-ended circuits of desire. There's something erotic going on. It's not the kind of eroticism that I'm used to, let's say, in heterosexual erotic films, or in gay erotic films. It's something different that it's doing with eroticism in relation to men putting on lipstick with a penis over their shoulder, or kind of posed shots like Delacroix with like breast visible with a lot of like fabric, and with somewhere there's a penis, but you don't know to which
flaccid
body.
Also,
yeah.
Importantly,
and
I would say.
Flaccid, yeah, the penises are flaccid. They're sort of not threatening. There's not phallic power. So I mean, these are some of the reasons why the film was a big scandal. It ended up like, actually, there was a big, it's a long story, a fascinating story. It went to the Supreme Court. There was, in the US, there was a screening in the chambers of the Supreme Court of this experimental underground film. I and a number of other scholars have really returned to that film and to this moment of Jack Smith's work as a way of understanding what the concept of queer could even mean. Because as I was describing, something that's not quite like hetero, it's not quite homo, but it's not quite not doing something with gender and sexuality. It seems queer. Like, that seemed like a really productive way to understand queerness as not simply about some particular identity position, but as some sort of something that's queer to, let's say, that's to identity, like oblique to identity and to genders and sexualities. And so there's that kind of crack, let's say, in kind of a normative system of representation. And Jack Smith was a kind of key figure for Andy Warhol, for what we know of Andy Warhol's social scene, the factory. Warhol himself said, Jack Smith is the only artist I would ever copy. And we know how important copying was for Warhol, so it's quite a lot of praise. And he took the concept of the superstar, this kind of self-created, glamorous figure. That was a Jack Smith concept. I'm not trying to give Jack Smith credit.
You can do it. He deserves,
he deserves
more
it.
than he often gets.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, but it's to really to help orient us, because I think Warhol's more famous. I love Warhol too, actually, but he's more famous. But I think Jack Smith is a kind of unruly core to that. But I'm talking about Jack Smith because I want to come back to Klaus Mettig and Katharina Sieverding. But I just want to say a little bit more about Jack Smith, because Jack Smith started actually as a photographer, and he was working with color photography in the 1950s color fashion photography, and he then became a performer in experimental films, and then he started making his own films. He then had this scandal of Flaming Creatures. He was traumatized by the political scandal, and then he started doing live performances in which he would work with slide projection. And for Jack Smith, well, maybe I'll just then biographically, Jack Smith in 1974 was invited to Cologne to the Project 74 Kunst bleibt Kunst, an art fair in Cologne. And as far as I know from talking to Klaus Mettig, Katharina Sieverding, that was the time when they met Jack Smith, and actually worked with him, helped him find a lab to develop his photos, and Klaus Mettig assisted Jack Smith on his slide presentation that he did at the opening of Kunst bleibt Kunst, and there are some spectacular photos in the catalog that Klaus Mettig took of Katharina Sieverding and Jack Smith in the apartment of gallerist Reinhard Onash in front of these French affichiste paintings or construction, where Jack Smith is getting into this colorful costume, which was his lobster costume, where he performs the lobster. And so there was this just biographical, historical connection. But, I mean, Klaus is here and can speak for himself, but since I have the microphone, I'm speaking a little bit for Klaus. Excuse that power grab. Thank you. But I know, I know from talking to Klaus a bit that how significant Jack Smith's aesthetic was. I think for Klaus Mettig and his own interest in, let's say, undervalued cultural products, undervalued formats, Super 8, the slideshow, but undervalued cultural products. Jack Smith was very interested in, not in Hollywood films from the time he lived, let's say the contemporary age of the 60s and 70s, but Hollywood films from the time when he was a child, the 30s and 40s, old genre films, mummy films, monster films, and above all, the fantasy films of Maria Montez, glamorous star from the Dominican Republic, who appeared in such classics as, I'll say the German titles, like Ali Baba and die 40, jetzt kann ich das nicht, 40 Räuber, ja, und die Schlangenpriesterin, Cobra Woman, or Arabische Nächte. So these fantasy films, and that fantasy world, Jack Smith would kind of interested in cracks in Hollywood fantasy, cracks in Hollywood glamour in Hollywood, the money that was in those big Hollywood productions. He liked to kind of break through that by making connections with contemporary New York life and politics. Okay, so it's a long, so I guess I'm trying to help, help me, Erika, or interrupt me, but I'm trying to like move us, let's say, from glamour to underground. And how do we get from glamour to underground, and how does that connect with Klaus Mettig and Katharina Sieverding in their artistic production?
I was really struck in the Ulrike Metzer's catalog essay. She talks about the fact that Sieverding has always had an affinity for the fairground. And I was thinking about this maybe as something that is important about underground, that is not captured in the word avant-garde or experimental film. That this kind of like raucous theatricality, also in the work of Jack Smith, you know, there's a sort of rambunctiousness, perhaps, to the underground, a kind of mocking of an idea of avant-garde seriousness that seems important, and that ties the underground to a kind of countercultural moment that is very different than we would associate, for instance, with like the austerity of structural filmmaking in the US in the later 70s when Mettig and Sieverding went to New York.
Right. That's interesting because we, the underground, this concept of underground in terms of film art production, at least let's say a New York or US American perspective, there's kind of a historical, it's almost like a period in art production that is often linked to the 1960s. And many discussions of underground film art production, Andy Warhol, Jack Smith, other figures making work at that time, they say that it was like from about 1961 to about 1966, 1967.
Being what happened then? 66 Chelsea Girls, 67 Wavelength. Are these the sort of markers that are the death knell of the underground? What happened?
Yeah, they say, because Andy Warhol started making films in 1963, and he made about 600 films in 5 years.
Just 600.
He didn't sleep. He said he only slept 4 hours a night between 1963 and 1968. So he made all of these films, and they were mainly underground films in the sense that he says they were movies we made just to make them, and we made them for ourselves and for our friends.
And often featuring ourselves and our friends.
Exactly.
Which would be another link to the films that we see in this exhibition.
And also, if we look at what Katharina Sieverding writes on the first presentation of her films, if I understand correctly, when she went to Rome in 1972, and there's a statement that she writes about how she makes her films and photographs, if I remember correctly, to communicate with others, to exchange identifications out of love for others. So we're talking about art production as social, as a means of engaging with the social, as a means of creating a context of love and sociality, and not necessarily of removing that artwork for some museum the way we see them here, where we could maybe take them out of context, we relate them to the white walls and to other things in this white walls. No, I think we need to think of these works in relation to the social space in which they were produced. Okay? We come back to that maybe, but so with going back to 1966, what happened is that Andy Warhol, who was making these films for a small social scene, the underground, he made this big film, 3.5 hours, 2 16-millimeter projections in 1966 called The Chelsea Girls. And that film became a hit. That film, unsurprisingly, with images of people shooting up drugs, with the kind of sort of violence against women, with sort of gay scenes, with beautiful Mario Montez, a Puerto Rican drag performer. But it became a big hit at that time. The underground went mainstream. And you can mark that because the critic for the New York Times, Bosley Crowther, said, we could tolerate these perverse little films when they stayed in lower Manhattan. But when they are now playing in Midtown in cinemas with carpets, then we have to draw the line. And so people, sort of historians of underground film like myself, we sort of mark this moment of the films now start playing in cinemas with carpets, if you will, as a sign that something has changed and maybe the underground moment is no longer there. This kind of mainstream acceptance. Bourgeois audiences come more with a voyeuristic look into a subculture rather than people from the subculture that's themselves who want to see themselves in the images and circulate them among their friends. So I think it's interesting if we then think about Sieverding and Mettig go to New York after the underground is over, if you will. Like at least this underground I'm describing, There, of course, we can talk about whether the underground is both a period and, let's say, a potential for art scene building. So there is, of course, maybe in the 70s, a new kind of underground forming, maybe around glam, rock, the New York Dolls, CBGBs, Talking Heads, Susie and the Banshees coming over, and around no wave, Diego Cortez, who's mentioned here in the archives. So there's maybe a new kind of underground, but there's a different relationship, I think, to the underground in New York around 1967. That they would, but Jack Smith came to Cologne in 1974. Sieverding and Mettig go to New York together in 1976, 77. I mean, I think Katharina Sieverding was already in New York beforehand, but I think, Klaus, that was your first trip. You were also in New York beforehand. Okay, so forget that. But at any rate, this important moment of 76, 77, let's say, is after this encounter with Jack Smith. And so I think we could think about what, I don't know, it's not necessarily, I don't think that Jack Smith, I don't think we should say that he influenced their work, but I think we're talking about the encounter of different artists and the recognition maybe of shared sensibilities. And that Jack Smith's interest in sort of undervalued cultural products is something that I think is one thing that maybe Sieverding and Mettig took from him.
Well, and it's also
or shared with him, yeah.
To think about, how the interest in undervalued cultural products, that was a part of a kind of queer underground sensibility in maybe the mid-60s. By the late 70s, sort of metamorphoses and reappears very differently in a much more specifically contemporary art context, which would be associated with the pictures generation. And so I wonder if it would be important for us to talk a little bit about the Whitney Independent Study Program, which is something that still exists to this day. But in 1976, 77, it was, I think, very specifically associated with an interest in theoretical approaches, semiotic approaches to mass culture, and to think about how, art could take up the role of interrogating mass cultural codes and conventions, specifically around reproducible images, the codes of advertising, and so on. And so, what is there to say maybe about the similarities, but also the very, very important differences between the kinds of American artists that we associate with the so-called pictures generation and the kind of work that Mettig and Sieverding were making in this moment and after?
Yeah, I don't want to take that on as a question that I answer. I want to push you a bit also, because the pictures generation connection is something that Victor Seidam brings up in the catalog essay, which I think is an interesting way of situating Katharina Sieverding's work. So people associated with the pictures generation, maybe most famously Cindy Sherman, but also like
Richard Prince, for instance, rephotographing Marlboro advertisements from magazines. So that idea of rephotography as a sort of strategy would be one important element, but also the idea of repurposing cultural codes more generally, as we see in Sherman's early work.
Right, and we're when we look at these photos in this wall, these black and white images, there's somewhere it feels like there's kind of a Cindy Sherman, like film still kind of quality, but I wonder, and maybe I'm trying to think of because like Jack Smith and that kind of underground queer relationship to kind of cultural transience, let's say the transience of things, meaning like old films that are no longer, that were culturally dominant in the 40s, but they no longer are today.
But the very important thing to say is that the reason they are no longer dominant today is because commodities come and go.
Right.
And so I think that this idea of the transience of things, it's important, but it needs to be linked also to this idea of living within a consumer society of mass production, in which there is a constant flood of new commodities all of the time. And this is maybe something that does link Jack Smith to the later pictures generation, which is this idea that the artist must operate within a field of trash, essentially, of detritus. Mass culture as something that just floods our lives with products, images, that then the artist can sort through. There is no pastoral, there is no nature, there is no real, genuine, authentic essence. Everything is secondhand, everything is for sale. And one must find the cracks within that somehow.
Klaus, did you want to say something?
Well, if you open up this way of thinking, of analyzing, it's probably interesting to think about that Katharina and me, we went to Buffalo to more or less to start our lecture journey through America and Canada. Cindy Sherman and Robert Longo were students at this time when we went to Buffalo and had a really, really super lecture with a lot of fun and a lot of interest by the students. So, of course, there's a kind of, there's a connection which you made up, but if you then put the different works aside, so it's a completely different road which each work shows, from Robert, from Cindy, and not by chance there's a complete different reception of this work, which is easy to analyze, and very much in the sense of the commercialization. This doesn't correct any. It's just one path, which in the terms of thinking about this, which one should keep in mind. So actually, Robert was the one who picked us up from the airport, and so this was our first encounter, first meeting, and yeah, a little bit later they started exactly. I mean, then there was Metro Pictures and all this, which was definitely not the road that we were going. Just by in terms of historical remembering.
Right, but thank you so much for that, Klaus. But I don't even think it's simply important to point out about different paths biographically or historically, but I think a crucial thing that I'm thinking about of what you said about this different relationship to commercialization, and that in the, like if we're to talk about some of Katharina Sieverding and Klaus Mettig's work in relation to pictures, do we lose the deep historical reflections that are happening here, that challenge a kind of easy consumption of the images? Is there a different, like, do we lose these cracks, if you will, in the surface of the images that that's one way I would question. And also, I don't know, I mean, I'm hesitant to let's say, reduce Jack Smith to a kind of easy line leading to the picture generation simply because of his interest in revaluing forgotten cultural products. Because I think there was also this kind of steadfast commitment to failure, commitment to non-commercial success in Jack Smith's work. And I'm interested to think through in what ways we could find examples of that in Sieverding Mettig, a kind of refusal of an easy way into the art market. Refusals built into the production of the work. Sorry.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's more than okay.
Talking about Jack in this way you do, I find very, very important for this for the topic of tonight. Yeah, and what I just wanted to point out, I think about the almost physical pain Jack had as soon as commercialization got close to his work. It was really, it was physical. I mean, he was really destroyed as soon as some of his pieces, babies, went into other hands commercially. And then there's one very, very important point which I want to point out, that Jack had a very, very he had a social agenda. I mean, his criticism about, I mean, the landlord story is so obvious, huh? And it's a little bit camouflaged by his really artistic superiority, which he really was. I mean, at least with his work with photography and film, I mean, this is on a very, very high level artistically. Huh? But in it is a very deep social element. Huh? So this, I think, is very important. So, and then probably we come to what you just made up a little bit in terms of Katharina. I mean, Schlachtfeld Deutschland, Great White Way Goes Black, and so on. Not to talk about my work; it's not on the walls right now. But also, my work went in on a different level. I mean, we are. I would call Jack. We are not brothers in arms. That's probably Katharina and he. I'm a little bit younger, so he is probably almost a father in arms. Yeah, right. That's my relationship to him. An impulse which opened up the possibilities for me to work with photography, with film, and so on. Huh? There are other people, but he's one of the. Katharina, of course, too.
I mean, I think there is something also, it's maybe an obvious point to make, but maybe an important one that, you know, in the 1960s and 1970s, film was certainly not viable on the art market, and photography also, you know, did not have the kind of market that it has now. Right. So we also need to understand these as reproducible mediums that were challenging a kind of commodification of the unique artwork as a good for sale. We talked a little bit about the use of Super 8 in these films here, but I mean, it's worth saying that this is a small gauge format intended primarily for the amateur market that was cheaper to make and cheaper to circulate. And that one of the things that we can say about underground film was that if it's 16 millimeter, 8 Super 8, these are non-professional gauges. It is not the 35 millimeter image. They are small gauge film formats, and that there was really an emphasis on democratization. You know, Jonas Meek has said, you know, we want our films to be seen by everyone. We want our films to be in every great American home. You know, and this is very different, I think, than the caricature that we sometimes see today of avant-garde film as a sort of elite sphere. You know, there was really something about circulating work as widely as possible. And I think that's an important thing to add in terms of this discussion of the social sphere around underground film and the idea of making a choice to work in artistic mediums that were not highly capitalized at the time.
Right. I think that's an important point, particularly when we see Super 8 films or 60 millimeter films today in gallery situations, and we see them presented. I'm not criticizing the presentation, but we see them presented on a video monitor. It sometimes could make us think that when they were made, they were easily shown that way as well. They could have been shown that way too, but that it could lead us, I think, we may immediately think more readily of, I don't know, films that we can make with our phones, rather than the kind of technical procedure of, let's say, with a Super 8, where you would likely shoot it, send the material to a lab to be developed. 16, maybe you develop at home. Super 8, some people develop at home too, but usually would send out, and then a couple weeks later you get it, and then you could maybe edit it or anyway. But so I think there's a different specificity to that format. But I wanted to pick up maybe just, we probably should close sometime sooner, open up for questions. But I want to go back to the social scene and think there's like two aspects, both in terms of the production of the work and I think also the kind of the significance of, let's say, if we take this other ethics from the underground of making work, circulating it to communicate with those you love and making it with those you love, then I think we need to talk about the love relationships that exist, let's say, in front of and behind the camera. And I think I'm thinking about, even in this middle room, where we get to see for the first time, let's say, these Polaroids, in this spectacular, I'm like really blown away by the exhibition and the opportunity to see so much of this work. So a lot of it is spectacular, both in terms of the largeness, but also in terms of the, like, oh my God, like that image really takes my breath away. But I think there where we see, where we're told in the little text that Klaus Mettig took these Polaroids. It's a work by Katharina Sieverding, and I think it's called a self-portrait. And I think there, what I was thinking about, and I haven't I don't know the answer, but was thinking about looking at that, was the kind of intimacy of the Polaroid, and the intimacy of that moment. And this is the beginning of a relationship. We know historically it's the beginning of a relationship between two individual artists, Klaus Mettig and Katharina Sieverding, who are getting to know each other, if you will, in this process of him taking a photograph of Katharina, intimate photograph, a Polaroid. It's immediate, and you have it there. There's no negative. It's right there, and then the process that went into the enlargement and the decision to enlarge this, to take a portrait of the self as another picture, like an appropriated image, and enlarge it to make this beautiful work in the center of that room in there. And so there we're seeing that the production of even the production of a self-portrait can be a social process, can be something that one produces in a relationship with the other, which kind of makes sense, because isn't the self already always constructed in relation to others? People are other people, Oscar Wilde said, and I think this we're back maybe to this relationality issue that.
But it's interesting because this idea of the social photograph and the idea of social relations produced through images, mediated through images, and ideas of the self produced through images and mediated by images, these are things that are talked about all the time now as characteristic of social media. You know? And so it's interesting to see how some of these ideas are there decades before through an entirely different relationship to photographic technology, the Polaroid, which in and of itself is a very interesting photographic form, right? Allied with instantaneity, but also with uniqueness. And then out of that, then rephotography. So, you know, there are also different photographic processes coming into play, different artistic intentionalities, different subjectivities, and that these things combine in a kind of processual way to give rise to the work that we see here. I wanted to, before we close, link that just briefly to the fact that we're sitting next to this archive display, because I think that the Polaroids and the finished work in this room, you know, give us one glimpse at an idea of process and collaboration, but these archival documents give us another. And I think it's very interesting to think about what function archival documents have in an exhibition context as something that can actually take, you know, what we know about an artist and sort of fill out a much broader context that is full of friendships, love relationships, travel, correspondence, all of these things, you know, are there in the way that every artwork comes into being.
Right, I think that's really nice, because often there is a tendency when documents are used in relation to, in exhibitions in relation to artworks, that they maybe provide us with the background, or this is, you know, you get the kind of, I don't know, maybe a contact sheet, and you see, oh, they didn't choose this image, they chose this one, or something, which I think is not the most interesting way to bring in. I mean, I'm always curious, but so it's interesting nevertheless. But I think with this idea of these changing archival elements, and that it, as you're saying, Erika, I think it allows us then to see that individual works emerge out of social, political, economic contexts.
And that individual artists emerge out of relational, social, political contexts.
Right, and it allows the work to be a contingency, that, you know, it's this image, it sort of could have been another, but it's this image, and the work emerges contingently out of specific social, economic, political conditions, and rather than that the work is explained or reduced to those conditions, that we can see the work as part of a life, as part of, and part of a history of writing, of traveling, of thinking, of loving, and not simply as some old idealist idea of art that it's just comes from within and is an expression of the brilliance of some single individual.
And maybe that's where, in fact, this kind of archive presentation has a quality in common with Sieverding's work, which is that in both cases there is this resistance to the idea of the single, unique individual governed by kind of deep subjectivity. Instead, we are in the realm of relationality, of iteration, of connection, of copying, of series.
Of history, sexuality and gender and politics. Maybe we could bring some of that, the gender, the transformer, gender, and queer stuff. It's sort of my bread and butter. Well, you should see my bed with all that butter, my bread and butter.
You mentioned earlier, like the idea of Jack Smith's work as a queer sensibility that is kind of anti-identitarian, and I think we can also see elements of that here as well, where instead it's really about becoming and about change and about the impossibility of stabilizing one's identity or even claiming it as so unique, let's say.
Right, because it doesn't matter as we're looking. We start in Transformer, the 8 slide or channel projection. I don't know if you have this effect, this feeling, but as I'm walking through it, at first I'm like, that's Klaus, that's Katharina, and then I'm like, is that Klaus? Is that Katharina? Like this kind of blurring of the two of them, and then I'm just like, I don't care who that is. I just think they're beautiful. Like I just think there is a kind of gender and androgyny. I have to admit, just one anecdotal autobiographical moment. The moment when I personally, for me, understood what queer meant. I was 26. I was walking down the street in San Francisco and I saw someone from behind, and I thought that person is so sexy to me. I had this kind of erotic desire for that person. And I had no idea what gender that person, what sex. I didn't know man, woman. It wasn't trans person. It wasn't clear to me what I found, maybe I'm telling too much about myself, but what I found particularly attractive and what desired me was the way that person wore or embodied a kind of gender, the way they just embodied gender, the way they lived gender, whatever gender that was desirous to me. And I thought, that must be queer desire, when it's somehow about this kind of, that's talking about desire, but and so this, and it's something that I experienced looking at Transformer as well, where this kind of transforming between one individual and another, between one artist and another, between one gender and another, makes, I don't know, I guess it centers that process of transformation more than any kind of binary. And that's something that to me seems queer, let's say avant la lettre, because this concept of queer, as in the way that I'm using it or we're speaking about it, only kind of came to be used in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, as activists and theorists kind of reappropriated that formerly negatively connotated term to be used as a schimpfwort, as a pejorative against any kind of gender nonconforming people. So, but it's something that I think is really strong for me in the work, is some kind of queer sensibility in a lot of the work, but specifically in that kind of, in Transformer, it comes to the fore for me in that way. I hope that's productive. But we'd, really be very interested in any kinds of questions or comments from all of you, including you, Klaus Mettig. Thank you.
Do we have questions? Fragen?
Ja, man kann auch Fragen auf Deutsch stellen.
Genau.
Und wir können übersetzen, falls das erwünscht wird.
I do have a question. You spoke, Erika, and what you too, Marc, about circulating works, and I would like to know, how do you see the role of File magazine in this context? This magazine created by A. Bronson and his collective General Idea, there was a collaboration of Katharina Sieverding with them, and there was this issue which she was the cover of this issue. Was it something for the masses of readers, or was something directed to an audience? What's the difference of, what's the role of printed media in this world of underground and of glam? Yeah.
Thanks. I think one way of talking about File magazine is to talk about it in terms of an interest in artist books and artist multiples as ways of breaking out of a specialized art economy predicated on the sale of unique objects. Germano Chilant talked about this as a small utopia that runs through the history of art from the Soviet avant-gardes into the present, where in lots of different ways, artists try to embrace mass dissemination by producing things cheaply that can circulate widely. Film is maybe a part of that, and certainly artist publications like File would be part of that. General Idea in Toronto created Art Metropole, which still exists to this day as an organization and a shop that sells exactly this kind of material. So there's definitely a real desire for mass circulation. Was File really a mass magazine? No, it's an artist publication, right? But it could circulate in a broad way, and it's always in relation to mass culture, right? So File is a riff on Life magazine, and even the use of these things like, Katharina Sieverding as a cover girl. There's a sense of appropriating these conventions that are very well known and then twisting them in some way. So creating, which I think is a very underground move, creating, your own economy of celebrities and beautiful people and interesting people, and sort of creating a kind of like counter system or parallel system of celebrity, something, obviously very associated with Warhol, but we see it, I think, also to a certain extent in a project like File.
Yeah, we're just going to, I totally agree with the way you described it. I was just going to bring up also Warhol's Interview magazine, of course, as another maybe model for sort of publicizing a kind of underground sensibility and sort of appropriating a mass magazine format, and it became a kind of mass magazine, but also allowing the kind of language of the underground to circulate. And in Interview in particular, which I know better than File, actually, the language of gossip. The way that the interview, like the actual interviews, the discussions that they have with different figures are really gossipy, chatty kinds of interviews. They're not the sort of Spiegel interview that you would get, herzlichen Dank, Herr Warhol, für Ihre Frage, or für Ihr Gespräch. And so I think that's also another way, is to that these magazines serve a purpose of allowing the circulation of underground rhetorics.
And it's maybe also a way of saying that, like, dominant culture does not have a monopoly on myth and glamour. And that these things can also be produced from another position, from the margins, from below, and so on. It's in Roland Barthes' essay, Myth Today. He says, truth to tell, the best weapon against myth is to mythify in turn. So to take the myths of culture and to kind of redeploy them, perhaps in exaggerated forms. And I think that, when we see the cover of File magazine that's here in this vitrine, it's a perfect example of that kind of action.
Thank you. Weitere Fragen? Wir haben noch ein bisschen... hier, bitteschön.
Hi, could you maybe say something about enchantment or maybe the idea of holiness? Because I think there's a lot of triptychon here in the exhibition, and maybe would be interesting. As well, maybe as well in this idea of Partei, that when you do something forbidden in public, you make it holy.
Nice. Yeah, it's a nice thought. I think I'd rather hear you say something about enchantment.
I mean, one thing that immediately comes to mind is, I mean, this is maybe, I don't know, a little meandering, but in the work of art essay, Benjamin talks about the false aura of the movie star, you know? And so there's an idea that perhaps like the traditional aura has withered, and like with the secularization of art, and we've lost that kind of sense of like a religious ritual presence from art, but it reappears for him in the close-up of the film star. And I think of that because I think there are so many images here that in various ways are taking up that idea of the close-up of the film star as this site of absolute, you know, spellbinding enchantment, which is absolutely a matter of a kind of cult attachment to a kind of mystical idea of presence. So it's not necessarily, you know, a religious function per se, but I mean, these are the idols that we worship in our time, right? Like images of film stars and celebrities and so on. And so I think there is, you know, a bigger discourse about how what maybe once was a sort of ritual function of art or a kind of presence that was attached to a religious function now is found in commodity culture and can be, as we've been discussing, sort of that idea of glamour and presence and enchantment can be taken up and worked through and diverted, as I think we see in a lot of the works here.
Yeah, and I like that. I subscribe to that as well, and I think not simply the triptych, but I think also the kind of alchemical process, which even maybe the solarization sort of touches, this kind of transformation of materials that has something enchanting about it in an occult sense, is something I think we see throughout the exhibition, going back to life, death.
Certainly,
life,
there's
death,
a strong alchemical
feeling. with this fire, and I think so there's some sort of like transformational potential of the materials, the slickness, the steel, the surface that one would slip off, that is linked to the transformation of the self. And even in life, death, I'm still fascinated and perplexed by this kind of sort of silver surface of Katharina's face in that film, and the kind of relationship, if we can even say maybe a transformative relationship to nature, the relationship between these kind of human creatures, self-styled creatures, and a peacock. So there's some attempt to confront the transformed human with nature in order to sort of establish a relationship, rethink our relationship to nature. And I think that's part of this process of enchantment. Thank you for allowing us to think about that together.
So if we don't have further questions, I would thank you both very much. I could stay for hours listening to you. And ja, vielen Dank, dass Sie hier waren. Die Ausstellung läuft noch bis zum 23. März. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss.
Danke sehr.
Thank you.